Good morning. Today we continue our Lent series entitled The Wilderness Where God Is. The Wilderness Where God Is. There are some kingdom principles that we can only learn in the desert. There are some kingdom principles learnt in the desert experience in a short time of weeks or months, which would take years to grasp and understand and apply in normal Christian life. And so God, by his Spirit, as we saw last week, leads us into the wilderness. God commanded the Jewish people annually to enact the Feast of Tabernacles. Every year for a week they were to build booths. They were to build these structures, these little cabins or tents of wood and branches and palm leaves, and they were to live in them all week. They still do it. Why did they do it? Why do they do it? Because they were to remember, to recall, to reappropriate, to never forget the lessons that they learned in the desert. God had brought them out of Egypt. God had led them into the promised land. But for 40 years they journeyed around the desert. And this people were to remember, the Jewish people were to remember the lessons of the desert. In the intertestamental period between the end of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the coming of John the Baptist, those 400 years, whole communities of devout Jews moved to live in the desert. A very famous community called the Essenes living at Qumran, where they found some famous scrolls in caves there. Why did they go there? They were trying to refound themselves. They felt somehow God's people had lost their way. They'd become compromised and they'd forgotten the lessons of the desert. And so they retreated to the desert, to the wilderness, to find God, to refound themselves, to recalibrate themselves so that they could then fulfill their destiny. Some suggest John the Baptist was associated with this community. Certainly we read in Luke's Gospel that the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the days of his public appearance to Israel. We don't know whether that's just a handful of years or for most of his life from a teenager on, but he spent his time in the desert, and then from the desert he was one calling out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." But before he could prepare the way for the Lord and prepare the way for the Lord in other people's lives, the way of the Lord had to be prepared in him, and that happened in the desert. Prophets are formed in deserts. When the church became institutionalized following the Constantinian revolution in the early 4th century, the church authorities quickly went from being the enemy of the state to being the kind of civil authorities. Bishops were no longer being martyred, they were made magistrates, and they got to wear the purple shirts of the Roman office holders. They still wear purple today. Why? It's an anachronism, but it comes from the time of Rome, when they were regarded as dignitaries of the Roman state. Some thought that the church had lost its prophetic edge, no longer suffering, but no longer faithfully witnessing, just enjoying its ease and comfort, accruing its wealth. They focused on building buildings and internal doctrinal debates. Many felt a growing compromise, and some withdrew from association with the sinful culture as they saw it to pray. Some of these became collectively known as the Desert Fathers, living in the caves, eating the locusts and whatever came their way, friends with the spiders, the heat by day and the cold by night, living a fasted life, seeking God and praying in the desert. Why? Because the church had lost its way in the compromised city. Living alone in caves could drive one nuts, and so there appeared to be a movement. So these isolated, prayerful hermits began gathering together in cells and little communities, and that perhaps was the birth of the monastic movement that became organized, if you like, a wilderness community that was turning the wilderness into a Garden of Eden through their life lived for God with one another in prayer in the desert. You can turn a desert to a garden. The Christian traditions of silence and simplicity, fasting, Lent, these are attempts built into the church calendar, the church spirituality, to self-impose certain lessons from the wilderness. God wants us to go through the wilderness. He wants us to be with people who have a bit of wilderness in our rucksacks or in our heart, for without it we will never attain maturity in our discipleship. We will never be able to turn what we've received, as it were, in the rivers of baptism, out effectively into a blessing for others without the desert. He forges us in the furnace of the desert heat. Now, the wilderness doesn't have to be a specific place or location or a specific discipline. God cannot always, in fact, he rarely does, take us to a literal desert, but he can bring a desert to us. He can put a desert in our lives, in our souls, or in our environment. It is often a situation or a circumstance that God engineers, God allows, God permits to teach you the principles of desert. And it's not so much a place outside that we go to, but a place inside that we carry. The essence of wilderness is of being stripped down. It's a removing of what insulates our lives, what protects us, what softens us, what makes us so comfortable so that we sometimes forget God. It's bringing us to a place where we need God. We're abandoned to him. We're relying on him. Selwyn Hughes lists 7 experiences that God uses to bring wilderness: failure, suffering, humiliation, bereavement, estrangement, doubt, and dereliction, loss. Failure, suffering, humiliation, bereavement, estrangement, doubt, and dereliction. Maybe as I read that, one of those pops out to you. Maybe that's where you are, maybe more than one. Maybe that's what you're going through. Heaven seems shut to your prayers. God seems distant. God seems silent. But I want to say to you, dear saints, he has not left you. He made a promise. He would never leave you or forsake you. It's impossible for him to lie. And he is working out all things for your good, even in what appears to be bad. Don't worry if you can't see it, or even at the moment struggle to even believe it. I tell you, it will come to pass. He is with you. He has not forgotten you. He has not abandoned you. He still loves you. He still has a purpose for you, and he's working out those good plans. The great Baptist preacher, Charles Spurgeon, who spent 1/3 of his adult life and ministry not able to work because he was taken out by sickness and depression, and yet was the most effective minister of his generation, if not his century. He said this: "I've learned to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock of ages." Why? Because the desert turns us, makes us utterly dependent on God. If you're in that place, don't turn away from him, turn towards him. Lean in towards him, and you will find that he's there, and he's working out his good purposes, and the desert will end, and there will be fruit in your life and intimacy with him. This too will come to pass.